Okay, so I want to do some thinking out loud about Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman, two of America's most relevant, most notorious poets, sometimes even referred as establishing in American poetry the two great veins that American poetry can follow. And I think there are interesting aspects that tie them together and that also I think are very essential in order to understand their work and their production as a whole and their objectives and it ties to understanding them more as spiritual projects than artistic projects. And I think this is very important because I think both Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson present in different ways very raw, very almost seemingly unedited poetry and streams of inspiration. And I think the reason why they are presented as such is because I think from their perspective, their works were more important as spiritual documents than as poetical devices, at least in the way we understand them now, where we have this notion of art for art's sake, that is kind of separated and divorced from any notions of religion or other forms of spiritual ideologies like that. And so it's very important, I think, for understanding both of them to regain that perspective of art that can serve for other purposes than art, because this notion that may seem obvious or even tautologically true to us now was probably nonsense to almost all cultures before modernity kind of collapsed those big narratives of life. We would have mostly religious art, and not only that, we understood them more, like that, in a more almost technological way, almost like spiritual technology. Like we would have the icons, like in churches, and they were produced to generate a very specific effect, to carry out something very objective in a sense. And so they have a very purpose driven um, ideology behind that production that was very tied to to generating certain effects. And the notion of beauty was probably not that relevant. And here's where we need a lot of nuance understanding these things, because it's not that they weren't trying to. It's not like beauty is opposed to these things. Um, it can coexist, but it's also sort of like a byproduct of the piece of art working correctly, or or a way through which those effects and those manipulations take hold and are experienced by the person. So like beauty by itself, it's something, as we see today, something very directionless, and whereas before it had more of an understanding of what does beauty is of what is taking place inside of beauty. To put it maybe a little bit vague, but there's a sense where beauty is not necessarily the end itself. And we can see it, to make it a little bit more concrete, in these both of these poets. Walt Whitman has a sense of almost not being a poet at all. It feels almost kind of like a journalist that had a mystical experience and is trying to kind of discover poetry for the first time, and he's trying to kind of invent it and stumbles into and it stumbles into like the poetical by accident. And of course, it is not by accident, and it is one of the fundamental aspects of poetry that the mystical and these transcendental experiences require the language of poetry, so that even if we lived in a very materialistic and very just this very concrete material reality, poetry would have to be invented even without prior knowledge about it. And this is, for example, one of the things that is also very interesting to learn about, for example, the poetry of San Juan de la Cruz, like the Spanish mystical poet, doctor of the church. He's considered the mystical doctor of the church, and you can see in his exegesis of his own works and his own poems, where he's kind of trying to tie this relationship, this essential relationship between poetry and the mystical, and why they require each other in very profound ways. And so we have with Walt Whitman this sense of exploring in it, and you see almost these fluctuations of inspiration in his work, where a lot of it can be pretty dull, almost like kind of trying to hit stones together to start a fire, and suddenly you'll have beautiful stanzas that are superb, and there's this sense of respect and reverence towards this process, where the text itself becomes more of like a travel log and a report, like this journalistic report on states of inspiration. And that's why, and this takes priority over the poetical, and in that more formal sense, in that sense that is more concerned with elegance of form and being concise, and other aesthetical concerns. So that a lot of passages that are dull, that are uninteresting, or less inspired, less accomplished, are left in the book because of that reverence to the process, because it's meant more as a travel log of the spirit than as a poetical work. And again, it's not like these are fighting each other, but it will change the it will change the attitude of the author towards what you want to present, and what is given more relevance in the text. So here it's more important this almost chronicle of inspiration than attaining like poetical brilliancy at the risk of editing and kind of distorting that experience. And with Walt Whitman, as there's, as I mentioned, this sense of being more of a prophet than a poet, and this almost not like naive poet that has to almost discover it by himself. And there's a similar aspect with Emily Dickinson. With her, she has more natural poetical faculties. She's not a journalist. She has studied poetry. She knows it. She's capable of writing like completely standard or just formal poetry in that sense of like understood as for art's sake or for beauty's sake, as we sometimes explain it. And with her, it's almost like this. We also have this sense of the mystical, of the spiritual, and there's this almost sibylline oracle quality to her. Like where in Walt Whitman we get more of like the prophetical, or that is more, maybe more learned, more rhetorical. With Emily Dickinson we get more of that oracular exploration and almost divinatory work into finding out the divine. And this is part of the reason why calling them poets falls short of what they were trying to do, and why they were probably misunderstood and kind of boxed and discarded. Because if you understand them and judge them based on purely poetical measures, both of them will not be necessarily as accomplished, because, as I mentioned, their work and a lot of what they're presenting is not meant as in that way as predominantly poetical outputs, but these more of journals of spiritual and mystical experience. And because we obviously in academia and in the humanities and all of this, taking like mysticism and the spirituality seriously under its own terms, not under these reductive anthropological or sociological perspectives, these aspects are not going to be necessarily taken as a priority and talked about under their own requirements and perspectives. And with both of them, there's a problem of living in a society that does not understand these almost basically jobs, right? Because like in ancient times, like both the prophet and the oracle, these people were well integrated into society in a way that could be almost simply mercantile. It was very well integrated and respected in a sense as a job as the carpenter or the mason or any other tangibly material and like pragmatic jobs. But we don't have those things, so there's no way to properly talk about Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson when they do appear, and they're not understood because these are not jobs. These are have been things that have been exiled mostly from our societies. So they have to pretend to be poets and understood as poets primarily in order to be properly to be to kind of like sanitize and made up and can be made acceptable towards society and the general culture. And a lot of the points I made about Walt Whitman, with his reverence towards inspiration, apply all the same to Emily Dickinson's work. The M dashes, as they are now understood as a relevant item in Emily Dickinson's work, serve to me like as a marker more of a spiritual process than a poetical marker. And I'll elaborate probably on a separate video, but there's this sense of they're a good thing to focus on to describe what can be named as the travelogues of spirit in Emily Dickinson's work, where there's this exploration and this process of harnessing inspiration and exploring those dimensions that is kind of cataloged and reported on in her poems. So they become like these chronicles and travelogues of a mystical experience, of a spiritual inspiration. And in that sense, sometimes they have this also raw, in a different sense, because she's more poetically minded, but she will attempt like maybe a direction and then close it with a dash and start a new one as she tries to explore and handle these more ethereal these ethereal channels she's accessing. And in that sense, they are also left as they are, both as evidence of her inspiration and experiences, and not processed and edited into a more coherent, unified, and almost refined product of poetry, right? So even though in her there's more of a consciousness and an awareness that of taking poetry as a spiritual practice, it's like her poems, at least a lot of them, and some of the most relevant of them are not refined, and there's this reverence again that that wants to present them more as this both where they speak not only of the central theme that she's exploring in itself, but also of her experience and her process of accessing those deeper realms and concepts. So they're both travelogue and poem at the same time. This mixture, and that's what makes it different and than the poetry of other more refined, which not necessarily, but more academic poets, we could say, or to put it very bluntly or coarsely. We could definitely talk about like a like a category of poets, like the inspired poets that are more concerned with leaving like this spiritual evidence and legacy, um, narrated and documented, than cultural, like the cultural niceties of more standard poetry. So in that sense, for both of them, um, leaving them as poets is missing the point of what they were trying to do. At least because now we understand poets in such a way. Of course, if we were talking about um, the ancient times, like in the Celtic traditions, right? Like with the Druids and stuff, like the notion of the poet was not so trivial. They always had these associations towards the religious, towards the spiritual. In that sense, poet would not be reductive. When you were talking about these bards and these inspired religious figures that were reverenced, like it's the same way that like the ancient Greeks, like to the point of like being almost feared, like in Plato's case, by their power and their oracular abilities. So a lot of things that could be expanded upon here. Of course, this is a conversation that can be taken as deep as one wishes to. But I think it's a good point of to start with discussion around these poets and also around deeper aspects of poetry that restore it to its original dignity. And it's not just relegated to rhyming schemes about precious maidens and stuff like that. So, thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you guys soon.